What's the most legendary work meltdown you've seen? My PE teacher in the 9th grade got fired for this non-Swifty stuff. She tells us to walk laps around the school for cardio day. Some kids decided to run and managed to finish 3 laps by the time the rest of us finished like 2. When we finish our second lap, we see the runners sitting, and the teacher just scream, "Get your silly Jesus puny booties over here." She proceeds to push the whole class onto the track in 97-degree weather and makes us sprint a mile and says that anybody who gets below 7:30 has to run it again. It was a 90-minute period. Everybody finishes, and she sits us down and calls us a multitude of bad words, and tells us that we should have finished 3 laps like they did instead of only 2, even though she told us to walk, not run, and they were running. The whole time we noticed that a girl isn't here anymore. We later found out she had to be taken away in an ambulance because she had asthma and our awful big fat meanie of a teacher denied her of her inhaler, so she fainted and was taken to the nurse's office immediately. I worked at Taco Bell while in high school. One of my co-workers was this guy who was really friendly, but also really strange. He was obsessed with being a straight-edge kid and drew the excess on his hands, and the whole 9 yards. He had a high-pitched, but pleasant voice, and spoke in an overly polite manner. Anyway, he had put in his 2 weeks and on his last day he was working the front counter register. This lady walks up to order and he just stares at her. After a few seconds she says, "Can you take my order?" In his very calm and polite voice he says, "Oh, I am sorry ma'am, but I cannot." There was another awkward pause and she says, "Well why not?" He responds with, "Because I am a dinosaur." He immediately started growling and roaring at her, and he walked back and forth behind the counter like a T-Rex. He did this until the GM who was back making food realized what was going on. On her way up to the counter he calmly clocked out and left. The GM had to apologize over and over again to the poor woman trying to order. That kid was a Taco Bell legend for several years. Edit, I forgot to add that he was a 6 feet 3 inches 250 pounds, dot-ish burly guy who wore eyeliner and had blue hair. I wasn't there to see it, but my co-workers have talked about the cabinet incident. Last year was my first year of teaching, and I was working in a low-income inner-city school. People kept saying to me, "There's no way you could possibly be worse than the last girl we had." When I asked what they meant, I was told that a few years prior the principal had hired a first-year teacher. Apparently one day she got so overwhelmed and upset by the behavior of her class that she chucked a ream of paper out the window and then ran into the back room, shut herself in a big cabinet and cried. Her class was unsupervised for a while. Apparently none of the kids had told anyone what happened, and when the principal found her, she was curled up on the floor of the cabinet, rocking back and forth and sobbing. Clearly, she was fired soon after that. I didn't stay at that school longer than a year because the principal was the equivalent of a big meanie loser, but when I left she said to me, "Despite all the non-Swifty stuff you were put through this year from your kids, you're the first teacher I can remember who I never saw cry at school. I'll take that as a compliment, I suppose." Writing financial software in the 80s. The systems analyst sitting at her desk near me suddenly burst into tears and wailed, "It's all so pointless, money doesn't mean anything, existential financial crisis." I worked in IT and one guy, who was one of the most chilled guys I knew, was responsible for the deployment, updates and maintenance of a specific product that generated high revenue. One afternoon I was sitting at my desk and just heard a big crash and saw one of his 3 monitors on the floor. He stood up, shoved the next monitor over the divider onto the next section's desk, then swiped the 3rd monitor off the other side, picked up his keyboard and smashed it as hard as he could, kicked his chair away and slowly, and calmly walked out the department, without saying a word. He came back to work the next day as if nothing happened. Everyone knew the pressure he was under and was very good at his job, so nobody said a thing. One of my old co-workers told me about the biggest meltdown he ever saw. The job was a pretty high stress to begin with and people were always on the verge of screaming at each other. So, this guy, let's call him Jake, had been working 12 to 14-hour days. Was on call 24 hours. Had 2 hours of commuting a day. Said he never saw his girlfriend who he lived with. Missed his niece's first birthday because of work. Dude was on the edge. Enter Sally. Sally was in charge of invoicing and had spent the whole previous week on vacation spending time with her daughter that was visiting. She came in on a Monday to finish up some billing, but was taking the rest of the week off for more vacation. She approached Jake while he was in the middle of working out some major issues, saying he needed to get some things for her to finish billing. Jake told her he would get to it as soon as he could. Sally continued to ask again every 10 minutes, getting more irritated with each request. Finally, she enters Jake's office, big open area shared with coworker mentioned above, and nastily says, "It'd be real nice if you do your job so I can go home and see my family." Jake proceeded to kick the door open behind him, breaking the frame and the automatic closer. At the end of the hall he kicked another door open, putting a hole in the wall behind it. He then went to the equipment storage area and began throwing pieces of metal rigging, making a ton of noise. This drew the attention of others who came to check out what was going on. When someone asked what was going on, Jake said, "If that burger says one more word to me, I'll be leaving in the back of a cop car." Sally was gone by the time Jake calmed down enough to go back inside. Jake wasn't fired or even written up. Management knew he was under stress, and Sally was told to keep her distance. Also, Jake is me. My blood pressure was so high my vision was blurry. Best I've seen was my 7th grade math teacher. There was a girl who always talked in class. She got moved to the front at some point and she was laughing and giggling as always. After being told to be quiet about 8 times, the teacher is standing front and center in front of her, back to her, and writing an example on the board. Girl has one of those plastic pencil boxes all the girls use to decorate sitting on the front corner of her desk. The teacher just cracked. In one smooth motion he spins around, yells "shut up," and smacks the box as hard as he can, and it goes flying 15 feet across the room, smashes into the wall. Pencils. Freaking. Everywhere. He swiftly walks to the door, slams it shut, and we could hear pounding on the wall. One brave kid peeks out the window. Dude was banging his head against the wall. About 2 minutes later, he walks back in. Crickets, not a noise in the classroom. He begins walking around, picking up every single pen and pencil, puts them all in the box, places it gently on her desk, and then just continues the example like the nothing ever happened. It was exquisite. I'm in radio, and one of the group of stations I worked at had an oldies station, a rock station, and a pop station in the same building. We had an announcer who was really eager and wanted to learn and work and was really a great guy, but the big bosses were total jerks to him and were stuck in their old ways of doing things. They treated the announcer, we'll call him Howard, really poorly, and Howard used to come in and vent about it. He ended up getting hired at another station, but before he left, he went into the music libraries and replaced all the Led Zeppelin songs on the rock station with a gospel song from the oldies station called Trumpets of Jesus. For an entire weekend, any time Led Zeppelin was supposed to play, Trumpets of Jesus played instead. Howard has since gone on to become program director and has won all kinds of leadership awards. Total legend. Edit, for those asking where it was at a station in Canada. A guy the first delivered pizza with had his parking spot taken by a guy he hated. He pulled out a giant monkey wrench out of his trunk and smoked him in the back of the head with it. Knocked him out. Yeah, he got arrested. And fired. I used to work in a kitchen in an old folks' home. I had a manager named Edward who was a know-it-all piece of uninformed non-swifty stuff. I had a coworker named E who had a very serious medical condition and required a certain medication at certain points of the day. Edward didn't like E or the fact that she needed to keep her medication on her person. One day E forgot her medication and begged to run home and retrieve it. Edward smugly denied her and told her to finish work. So she tried and ended up briefly collapsing. She was okay but very weak and disoriented. Edward grabbed her by her arm, escorted her to her car, handed her the keys and told her to leave. Then he left. To go tell anyone that would listen that E was in rugs and he smelled booze on her. E was in the parking lot and called her mom to take her to the hospital. E was only 20 and very scared. E was discharged that night after some fluids and came back the next day upon hearing what Edward told everyone about her. She stormed into HR screaming for them to bring Edward's butt in the office immediately. As soon as he was called in, she whipped her name tag at him. I obviously lingered close by like a nosy bee. She was screaming at the top of her lungs that Edward denied her to go home to get her medication. That was on file and I was very aware of, and how freaking dare he accuse her of being a rug sick. And if he really believed she was under the influence of something, how stupid was he to put her in a car on the company's property, leaving him liable for her damages? At this point much noise can be heard as all three of them are screaming full force at one another. She threatened legal action and stormed out. Well, she did take legal action. For a ton of non-swifty stuff, including putting a clearly ill person behind the wheel. Not too long after this I also quit. And a few months later Edward was no longer employed by the kitchen but rather was working as a deli boy in the local grocery store. I don't know what happened with S lawsuit, but I hope that place and Edward got everything they deserved. Also, honorable mention to R, the maintenance man that threatened to boom my old boss in the face for being such a weasel. As a former line cook, the only thing I'm surprised about in this story is that you had an HR department. Ha 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 he 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 ha. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe to Reddit Said It. Or don't. I'm not your boss.